Okay, hi everyone. So in this tutorial, the third one in the series, we're going to jump straight ahead to looking at lighting and rendering. The reason for this, before I could go into a lot more like 3D modeling, architectural detail, but I want to get you sort of all the way to something closer to the end of the process where we'll add lighting and render out images, just so you can sort of see how it all comes together, and then possibly also use that to judge how much detail you need to go into in making the space. As I mentioned at the beginning of this series, a process of exhibition design in Blender, it can be used to make really photorealistic renders. You know, maybe you want to propose an exhibition to a museum or curator, but it can also be used just for your own planning. You know, maybe you need to supply someone a floor plan with just a basic layout. So in that case, you might not need to go to huge amounts of detail. So that's why I want to skip straight away to lighting, and then we'll come back and do a little bit more architectural detail. Okay. Also, it was apparent in class last week that some of you who might be working on older laptops are having a few performance problems with Blender. So I wanted to just address a few ways that we might get around these, and it might be a little bit easier for you to work on your older laptop and still be able to get some of this work done. Okay, so just a few settings that we can go through. First of all, make sure that if you look over on the render settings here, make sure that you're using Eevee. Blender by default will open in Eevee. It's a much faster real-time render engine. Cycles, which is the ray tracing engine, will definitely slow down your computer. The second thing, which I guess is maybe a little bit more basic, is working in the solid. I'm just pressing Z here to look at my render options, but we can also click the top right-hand corners here. Wireframe and solid mode, these will be the easiest for your computer to calculate. You know, we're not calculating any lighting or texture information, and these will be definitely like the easiest for your computer to handle. Okay, so lighting mode, solid mode. If I go into material preview by pressing Z, this will be a little bit more taxing on the computer, and once again, rendered mode probably will be using the most resources. Staying in Eevee, the other thing we can do technically is we can lower the samples. They're already set pretty low by default in the viewport. The render here, I'm going to lower the samples to 8 or something. You'll notice things might get a little bit more fuzzy here, but just for the purpose of working on your computer, I think if this helps you be able to use the material preview mode, then go for it. Render samples, you know, this shouldn't really affect how you're working in the viewport. We can talk about samples a little bit later in rendering, but some more important things that might help you out to be able to work in this material preview mode is you could turn off your shadows. And you could also turn off the ray tracing. You'll see as soon as I turn this off, basically a lot of other effects of like lighting bounces and what we call ambient occlusion, these sort of shadows that appear where two walls meet each other. These will all get turned off, and you know, this will just be a little bit less realistic and a little bit harder to sort of visually understand. But again, it should be less taxing on your computer. Another setting you can use, it shouldn't really affect us here. You can turn on this thing called simplify, and I think what that does, it just puts a cap on how many geometry subdivisions and particles and volumetric effects here. But to be honest, for those of you who I saw were having some computer problems in class, I think what we're working on is very simple, or it's very simple already, and so this probably won't make much of a difference. The final thing I can recommend is just to check that there's not any like extra background processes running on your computer that might be slowing it down outside of Blender. So you can look at things like updating your software, and even just, you know, do a quick ChatGPT or AI search, describe the problem that your PC is running slowly, tell it what version of Windows or Mac OS you're running on, and just see if there's any basic advice that it can go through and find a way to to speed things up. I've seen plenty of tutorials online where people have been able to run Blender on reasonably old and reasonably lightweight computers. So hopefully some of that can make these tutorials a bit more accessible with really any laptop, because we want you all to be able to benefit from these lessons. Okay, so let's get back into lighting. I'm just going to turn some of these back on because it makes it a little bit easier for me to demonstrate. So I've got my shadows back on. I'll put my samples back up to 16. And yeah, that's all fine for now. All right, so where did we get up to? What we did in class, if I turn these collections on, you know, we had to play around with a whole bunch of different projects that you're making, and we made some little sketches of, you know, how it might look if we played around with different installation ideas. And we also put in some lights. So if I go to my rendered mode here, I'll see my lights. These were really just really quick guesses. And if we go to the images of the gallery, you'll see that the lighting of the gallery is quite different. For a start, it's not a dark room like this. It's got these fluorescent kind of track of fluorescent tubes, and then it's got the gallery lights here. Now, one thing that is always a bit of an unpredictable variable is it can be hard for us to know exactly how the final lighting setup will be when you're sharing an exhibition space. But what I want to do today, just to give you the skills, is we're going to recreate this lighting track, and then we're going to add in some of these spotlights. And that should give us a reasonably more tailored lighting simulation that we can use to plan our exhibition. Okay, so I'm going to go into the lights here, and I'm going to delete all of these old spotlights. We don't need them. X to delete. And I'm going to delete this sunlight. X to delete. Okay, now things are looking nice and dark. Finally, you'll notice that the workspace is not entirely dark yet. And that's because Blender by default, it puts in a background color with a strength at 1. So, you know, if I change that color here, you'll see kind of what's going on. If I turn the strength to 0, you'll see that now we've got a totally black screen. And if I hide my axes, we've got nothing in the screen. We've got one little light there that could be on an imported object. Maybe we'll have to see what that is just for fun. Okay, so I'll just put this back up and put this back to gray. And then I'm just going to, oh, okay, look, it looks like that little red thing is an imported object. Oh, we put an emission texture when we were playing around in class. Okay, that makes sense. All right, I'm just going to delete that shelf. We don't need it. Okay, so first of all, I want you to turn that environment color just to 0, or you could, you know, set it to black. Same. Right. The next thing I want to do is we'll just check what our render looks like. It should be a completely black screen. So if I go into the animation tab, on the left-hand side, I'm looking through my camera, and on the right-hand side, I've got my 3D viewport. Now, if you're not seeing that, it might be that you don't have a camera in your scene, or that you just haven't set it up. So at the moment, this is my camera, and if I look from the top and move it around, you'll see it's moving that viewport. If I accidentally, you know, press my middle mouse, or if I turn off camera to view here, you know, I could accidentally lose that camera view. All we need to do is select the camera, either in your scene collection here, or just select it here. And if you're on a computer with a numerical keypad, you can press Command numpad 0 and it will look through the camera. Or if you're on just a regular like laptop without that numerical keypad, you can simply go View, Cameras, Set Active Object as Camera. And that'll make sure we're looking through the camera. I'm going to press N and bring up my viewing parameters here, and I'm going to click this Lock Camera to View, and then I can actually just, you know, move my camera through with by zooming and using my regular viewport controls. I'm just going to set up my camera looking at this little art installation here. Okay, so I'm going to go Render and Render Image, and it should come out as a completely black screen. Let's give it a moment. Okay, there we go. Completely black screen. That's exactly what we want. It's just because there's no lights. So no lights means no matter how good the geometry is, we can't see it because there's nothing to illuminate it. All right, so I'll just close that render and let's add some lights. So first of all, I'm going to look at these neon light tubes here. So we'll do a combination here of a little bit of 3D modeling and also adding a light, and they'll kind of work together. But it's kind of a nice trick. So I will just shift right click to put my 3D cursor into the space, and I'm going to add, let me look at those lights again. Yeah, I'll add a cylinder. Shift A, add a cylinder. I'm going to scale it by 0.1. GZ, lift it up. Maybe I'll look from the top here. I'm going to rotate it on the y-axis by 90 degrees. Okay, so now it's lying down. I'll go SX, make it a bit longer. And we're just going to do this by eyeball. I'm going to press scale to make it a little bit thinner. And yeah, they're kind of thin fluorescent tubes. And I'm going to guess, I don't know off the top of my head, I'm going to guess that these tubes are something like 90 centimeters long or something like that. So if I go SX, I'm going to, okay, it's going to be this transform here. If I press SX, I can see that that's the only dimension that's changing. So I'm going to make that 0.9. Okay, so that's going to be my fluorescent tube. And at the moment it's 5 centimeters high. Maybe that's a little bit high. I'll make that 0.04. Yeah, that's fine. That'll be one of our fluorescent tubes. The next thing we'll do, I'll just make this little housing unit thing. And basically I'm just going to make one little section. Well, how do these things work? Do they have... Yeah, it looks like there's kind of a section here. I'm just going to make something like that, and we'll duplicate it across. So I'll press Shift S, and I'm going to say cursor to selected, and that's just moved my 3D cursor up to where my light is. Press Shift A, I'm going to add a cube, and of course that's much too big. I'll make all of the dimensions 6 centimeters, 0.06, and then I will just lengthen, whoop, wrong one. I'll lengthen it on the x-axis to, we made the other one 0.9, so let's make this one 0.92 or something. And then I'll just press GZ and lift it up, and let's see what we get. Something like that. That might be fine. And maybe I'll just scale it down a little bit on the z-axis. And just to be nice, I'm going to just extrude it a little bit. So I'm going to press the question mark backslash just to isolate select it. And I'm going to select this face. Actually, I'll press the question mark backslash here so I can see everything again. Because, yeah, actually I'll do this from the top. That might even be the easiest way. Go into wireframe mode. And I'm just going to extrude this face by pressing E, left click, scale. Oh, that's only scaling on one axis. Why is that? S and SY. That's better. I'm not sure why it was only scaling on one axis there. All right, now SX. I'm just making that little gap. Going to go back into shaded mode. Yeah, that looks fine. Okay, and then I'm just going to press E, left click, G, Z, and just move it up. Let's look from the front view, wireframe, and I'm just making a gap that I'm going to put that fluorescent tube inside of. This is like a very, it's kind of a big simplification of what these tubes actually look like. But again, it's not going to be really obvious in the render, and I think this might be close enough. I'm just going to I'll add a quick little white shader to this box. Do we need to add any more detail to it? For now, I think that's okay. So, and I want to make sure I'm putting these kind of in a bit of a logical place. So that has accidentally gone into my artworks folder. So I'm going to call that light fluoro light fixture. and I'll call this one fluoro light tube. And I'm going to move these into my lights and cameras. Actually, no, I'm going to move it into my architecture collection, and I made an extra little folder called architecture extras. You can do that yourself. You can always just like right click and go new collection, and it'll make one here. It's called architecture 2. But architecture extras, I just put like the doors and the lights and stuff like that inside there. And I might just make a new little collection here and call this one light tubes. And the reason I'm putting all of these things in collections like this is sometimes you want to turn things on and off easily. Like I might grab all of my doors and put these in a collection and call it doors. Grab all these, put them in doors. Okay, that's looking better. Okay, so now I can untick my doors and all my doors will disappear, and my light tubes. Okay, so now I'm going to raise this light tube up to roughly where it should be in the space. So I'll do that by just going into my Y orthographic view, go into Y-frame, and here we don't have an exact measurement, but we can kind of guess that it's clearly higher than this. It's not quite at the ceiling height, so I'm going to just put it. Again, you know, when we're not in the site, there's all sorts of things we realize we didn't measure. Let's look at some other photos. Okay, they're pretty high. Certainly a lot higher than the doors, so it's probably going to be like up here somewhere. We haven't done any of the modeling of the space, and actually these doors might be at that height there. But okay, we can, next time somebody's on campus, we can even check that. So I'm just going to put them up here for now. And we can always lower them later, but that's good for now. Okay, so I'll go back into solid mode, and I'm just going to jump into my shading tab. And at the moment, I can't see anything interesting. So let's go view, frame selected. Okay, looks like our viewport was off in the middle of nowhere. Okay, and we are in material preview mode, that's fine. So on this, I'm just going to make a shader and call it fluoro light fixture. It's going to be the material. Fluoro light fixture. And I might just make it a little bit off-white. I'll just, drop that down a little bit. And this one we're going to call fluoro light tube. Okay, all right. So now the first thing I want to do is I want to make this light actually give off some light of its own. Oh, actually, no. First of all, let's we're going to duplicate it. We're going to make that kind of array of lights. Let's do the duplication first. So we're going to make that box of lights. Okay. So now that we have our two lighting, objects here, we've got our fluoro light fixture and our fluoro light tube, and we've set up materials on them. We've put materials on them, but we haven't changed anything yet. You should have on the fluoro light tube, you should have this one, and then on fixture, so material. That's all good. So next thing, I'll just jump back into solid mode. Next thing we want to do is make, if we go back to our reference images, we want to make this row of lights. Okay, so there's a few ways to do this. The slowest possible way would be to shift select both, shift D, and duplicate them forever. But that would take a very, very, very long time. Instead, sorry, that didn't really show. If I shift D and GX, yeah, that would take forever. And it would have drawbacks. If we wanted to change one of them, we'd have to change them all. Another way is we can use the modifiers here, and we could go array and put that on both. But the problem with that is that because they're a slightly different length, we'd start inheriting that different length as an offset. And you can see here that offset's getting larger. If I turn that array up to 3 and this array up to 3, that offset will get even more kind of apparent. So that's not going to work, so let's take that off. But we're going to do sort of a little hack that's still an array but got a little trick to it. So first of all, I just want to make sure that you've applied the rotation and scale on these. I think I've already done mine, but your cylinder probably still has a rotation there from when it came in. So if that says 90, just press Command A, apply rotation, or you could go Object, apply rotation, and do the same command for scale, Command A, scale, and I'm just going to check that on our lighting fixture. So both of these should have all zeros in the rotation and all ones in the scale. Next thing we want to do is I'm just going to put our 3D cursor back to the lighting fixture, Shift S, cursor to selected, and I'm going to Shift A and add a plane. And I'm just going to scale that down to be kind of the same size as our light. So this is 92 centimeters, so I'll make that 0.92 as well, and I'll make the Y 0.05. And then GZ, I'll just drop it down. So there is our plane that's just directly below our lights. And I'm going to call this light underscore instancer. Okay, next thing we need to do is we need to parent these two to the instancing object. So I'm going to left click and shift select the housing and the tube, and then finally shift select the instancer and object parent to object. Okay, so now we have this light instancer with these two underneath. If your outliner doesn't look like that, it might be because your plane was not inside this little collection. And if you try to parent something that's in another collection, Blender, the outliner starts to look a bit weird. So best to have this in the collection already, or even if you've done your parenting, you can just drag it and put it in the same collection so you get this sort of clean looking hierarchy. Okay, so there's just one or two more tricks we need to do. With the instancer selected, I go into the Object tab here, and I go into Instancing, and I click Faces. Now, mistake. That's we've got our lights instancing, but they're a crazy scale, and that's because I forgot to apply the scale on my on my lighting tube. You can see that the scale is still what Blender thinks is like the default 2 by 2 meters. So I'm just going to click Command A, apply the scale. That's better. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Now that's set up, we can just add an array modifier again, and now it's arraying both the tube and the housing unit with the correct offset. And if I make that really long, we're not having that bit kind of that offset between the tube and the housing. So that's good. The last thing we need to do back on our instancing object in the instancing properties, we're just going to hide it in both the viewport and the render. So that means we're only seeing the instances, the things that we want to see, the tube and the housing. So I'll go into our top view and I'll press GX and I'll just move this down to where we want the lights to start. And I'll go back into the array and just turn it up until it kind of covers the room. 23 is a guess. I'll leave it at 23. And then I'm going to add one more array. And I'm going to, instead of arraying on the x-axis, I'm going to array on the y-axis, and I'll drag that down, something like that. So now we've got both of our lines of lighting tubes, and we now need to duplicate it because I need to make just those two end pieces, and that's just easier to do on a separate object. So to duplicate, you just want to shift select everything in that parenting hierarchy, and then just press Shift D and left click straight away so you don't move it anywhere. And then now we can collapse this. I'm going to delete both of the array modifiers on the one we copied, so now we've just got the original one here, RZ90, so it's rotated 90 degrees. And then we can just look from the top, GX, and I'll just zoom in a little bit, GY. If we look at the picture, I think there is even there's a little gap there, so I'm going to just keep that sort of handmade gap because it's a bit more realistic. And now we'll add the arrays again. So add an array, and this time it's going to be in the negative X direction. I'll just make that -1. And we might have to, okay, we might have to shift this one back a little bit just so it kind of matches up there. So if I go into the, on our light instancer, the second array here, I'll probably just need to make this number a little bit, what's that? Bigger, technically, or smaller, I don't know. We're in negative numbers. Okay, so something like that looks good. So I've got one tube, the other tube, and now back on the other light instancer, let's just make that second array. And this time I'll set that to 0, and I'll set the, oh, no, not there. We're going to move on the Y. And it's the our X and Y's are flipped just because I've still got that rotation there, but this is okay. Let's look closely again and just get that gap in a nice position. Okay, that'll do. So now we have our lighting tubes set up as geometry. So now I'll try to move through this pretty quickly. I want to get us set up from here to something like, oh, okay, good. My composite is empty. We'll get set up from here to something that looks a little bit more like our reference image. So first of all, let's go into our animation tab. And let's just, I might reposition the camera a little bit. Now yours won't have that little white line yet. I'll get to that in just a moment. But I wanted to grab my camera and maybe I'll just look through here in solid mode. And I just want to position my camera in some way that kind of is a little bit similar to our reference image because it'll help us. So I sort of come down to a bit more of a human perspective, something like that. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a roof. I've done it already, but I'll show you how I did it. I just clicked on the floor, Shift D, left click, and then GX and move it up. And I'll probably just have it sitting just nicely tight on top of the roof. And I'm going to rename this roof. Another thing I'll do is I'm going to hide it in my viewport just because it's kind of annoying to be trying to look inside a closed box. This little eyeball here, that will hide something in the viewport, but it'll still show in the render and vice versa. So let's have a look at what that looks like. So I'll just go into, I just want to go into my shading and turn off something I realized I left on from when I was testing. I'm going to go into the fluoro light tube and I'll disconnect these and I'll put that back to 0. So that setting should be the same as yours. Yours is probably set to white. And now let's go back into our animation, set this to rendered, and let's render an image. Now, this should be pointing out the obvious. It should be a black screen if I've got my settings correct. Yes, great. So the reason it's black is that we don't have any lights in the scene. And I think that's a pretty good way to start lighting. If yours is not black, yours might look something like this. If it does, it's this by default. Blender has an environment setting in the world properties that by default is set to like a gray color and with a strength of 1. So I'll just set that to 0. So now we've got nothing lighting the scene. Okay, so now let's take a look at our fluorescent lighting tubes. I'll just hide the roof from our viewport, and I'll just, yeah, I've got this set up here. I could also just click on our lighting tube here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the color of the light, and also I'm going to add this thing called an emission. So I'm just going to make sure I'm looking at my object for convenience. View, frame selected, there's my tube. And I'm just going to Shift A and add RGB, which just gives us a color input. And I'm just going to be a bit lazy. I'm going to put the same thing on my emission and my color. First of all, I'm going to put the strength of this to 1. And if I go into our rendered mode, when I put this to 1, you'll see that all of our lights start emitting this color. And if I turn this up, it should get brighter and less bright and so on. As fluoro lights, they tend to give off a slightly cool light. traditionally. So I'm going to make this just the tiniest bit blue, just a little bit, something like that. Maybe like, ooh, something like that. That should be fine. And I'm going to render an image. So we can look in our animation tab. We don't have to be in the animation tab to render an image, just, I don't know, just for convenience. Render image. Now, what we've got here is we're getting a tiny bit of illumination here, not much. I think I've still got a setting turned on that you might not. So let me just, yeah, let me just turn all this off. Okay. So let me just delete that. Okay, let's just render that image again. Render that image. And okay, we're getting basically like this line of our lighting tubes and a very tiny amount of light in the room. So that's a good start. We're getting some illumination. The first thing I want to add, if you look at the image, most lights have what we call bloom, this sort of fuzzy glowing effect. So we're going to add that. So if I go back into my Blender, we're going to click into this tab called compositing. You might see your render here, you might see nothing. I'm just going to click on use nodes, and when you do that, you might get, you should get some nodes already. If you don't, you can just Shift A, and we put in one called render layers. And then we're just going to put in two more. One is called a viewer. And if I connect this here, that should put my most recent render in the background. And then I'm just going to put in one called composite, and that's going to be our final render. And then I'm going to Shift right click and just make a little node. And what that means is, oops, what that means is if I add something here, it will affect both of these. Now, the next thing we're going to add in is called glare. And glare gives us that sort of fuzzy, bloomy effect. If I hit render and render image now, we probably, by default, I don't think we'll see a huge amount, but we can just change, you know, a couple of little settings, and we should get that glare. Oh, one thing I forgot to do. I'm rendering now in slot 6. I'm just going to do that again in slot 1. What these things are is they're sort of temporary placeholders for your renders, and it's important because you can make a change and then compare it to the previous render, and that's really how we get our lighting to look good. If you're just kind of guessing every time, it's really hard to know if you've made a good change or a bad change. So comparing your renders in the slots is useful. Okay, so we've got our glare set up, but it's not doing much. I'm just going to turn the threshold down a bit. If I hover here, it says the glare filter will only be applied to pixels brighter than this value. So basically, the lower I make this, we'll get a bit more glare. If I make that really low, we'll get that really sort of glary, hazy sort of thing. I think I'll put it, maybe I'll start at something like 0.5. If I go back and view my render, we can see that glare there. Now, the reason we're seeing the change here without having to re-render is because this is a compositing effect that happens after our render. But okay, so that's kind of, I'm okay with that to start with for our fluorescent lights. We're going to add in a separate object that's going to give us like the light that we'd be expecting to come from these. It's just going to be a lighting component called an area light. If I go back into my animation tab, I'm going to link into this tutorial a nice video by the Ducky 3D channel, which goes through all the different Blender lighting components in a slightly more like scientific detail. It's a great video, and I think it should explain sort of why we're using some of the lights that we are using in this tutorial. Okay, so let's add in that area light. I'm going to press Shift A, and this time I'm going to go Light, Area. And this object is coming here. The height is, I guess it's kind of okay. It's right where our lights are, because that's where we left the 3D cursor. I might just lift it up a tiny bit. Now I'm going to look from the top, and I'm going to just scale it to fit the area of my lights. So scale it on the x-axis, grab it on the x-axis, oops, GX, yep, SX, something like that. Then GY, SY, something like that. That looks okay to me. And now we need to turn up the power on this light, because we can even see in our viewport it's not doing a great deal. So if I go into the light settings here, it starts at 10 watts. Now in the Ducky 3D tutorial, they actually describe the difference between this measurement and what you might see on the packet of a light bulb that might refer to how much power it uses compared to how much radiance it gives. This 10 watts actually refers to the radiance, but if you want to get technical in this, the Ducky 3D tutorial has lots of great links. I'm just going to pop this up to something like 150, and we can immediately see it started illuminating our scene. Maybe let's pop it up a little bit higher, like, I don't know, 300, something like that. And if I render this, well, let's view render, and let's just go into slot 2. I might have an old render there, that's fine, I'll just render on top of it. We'll take back slot 2. And okay, we're not seeing much, and that's probably because I might have a conflict between where my light is and where my roof is. I probably got, if we look from the side, I've got my light inside my roof. So I'm going to drop my light down a bit. There we go. Now we can see it. And as I'll show in the next tutorial, the roof is different. It's higher. It's got more detail. So that will also make a big difference as we're improving this model. But as I said at the beginning, I want to add lights now just because I want you to see just how quickly adding the lighting will really lift the quality of this exhibition simulation. Okay, so let's just re-render slot 2 because that was a bit of a fail. Render image. Now that the roof is back in position, we should be looking a bit better. Okay, good. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a component that's called an irradiance volume. And what that is an irradiance volume does a slightly more accurate lighting calculation, which is approximating the other type of rendering that we haven't really touched here, which is called ray trace rendering. I'll just quickly explain what I mean by that. I'm going to hit save. We've got different render engines inside Blender. The two main ones, Eevee and Cycles. Now, Eevee is a real-time render engine, works fantastically well, especially on low-powered computers, and if we do a few tricks, we can get it looking really, really good. If I switch, I'm just going to put this on Material Preview. If I switch to Cycles, it's going to be much slower, but it's much more accurate. So if I've turned my samples down here, usually this is sort of in a kind of 4K type of area. I've turned it down a lot. I'll just quickly show you what it does. Eevee is going to, Cycles, it's going to calculate sample by sample what the render should look like. Actually, if I render the image, this might be a little more visible. Basically, it's going to start with a very noisy image, and over time, it's going to simulate samples of light and calculate what the sort of real reflections and shadows of all of the objects should look like. So you can see as this is building up here, it's done the first sample, and we've got this very noisy image, but it's going to go sample after sample and replace the noise with accurate calculations of lighting and reflection. And then because I've got these samples so low, it'll run a denoising filter and we'll come up with a pretty good looking image. A much more accurately lit image than Eevee, but as you can see, much slower. So I'm just going to cancel that render because just by hitting escape, because we're going to be working in Eevee. So I'll just close that, switch my rendering engine back to Eevee, and I'm going to show you how to sort of fake some more of those details. So, okay. Also, just a little check. Make sure, as I said at the beginning, you should have shadows turned on, ray tracing turned on. Simplify in this case won't really be doing much because we've already got a pretty simple scene. But ray tracing and shadows will make it look a lot better. Okay, so let's add this next component, the lighting volume. Okay, so in this point I've hit Shift A and I've gone, instead of light, I'm going light probe, and we've got this irradiance volume. I'll just switch this to solid so my viewport's a little quicker. Okay, so we've got this light volume here. First of all, I just need to resize it a bit to fit my scene. So I'll look from the top, SX, and I just want it to kind of cover my gallery. And we're basically telling Blender where we're going to run this lighting calculation. GY and SY, scale it up, something like that. And we'll also need to scale it on the Z axis, and then GZ, move it down a little bit higher. That should be fine. And now you can see if we've scaled it, we haven't changed the number of these little lighting probes. So if I just click on the data property for the irradiance volume, I'm just going to up the number of these. Now, I don't know off the top of my head how many of these you should have every distance. I'm sure there's a setting that, well, I'm sure there's a page in the Blender documentation that describes this more accurately. I'm just increasing it a bit out of my sort of common sense of using these objects. If somebody wants to correct me here in the comments, please do. But you know, something that's not too crazy, but just has these little irradiance volumes everywhere. And then what we need to do is we need to do a bake. And so what's a bake? Baking our lighting is basically running this calculation with our lights as they currently are, and it will calculate where some of these shadows and bounces should go. And what that means is if we change our lighting, we just have to redo the lighting bake. But I'm just going to click Bake Lighting Cache. Depending on your settings, that might take a long time or might be pretty quick. But now if I go Render, View Render, and I'll go into a new slot, Slot 3. Oh, that's an old render I'd already done. But let's go Render Image. And we're going to compare this to, I think, the slot 1 we had. Basically, we should have slightly more accurate shadows and stuff than we had. Ooh. Yeah, I didn't keep my slot here. Okay, I'll just delete the lighting cache here by pressing delete, and I'll go Render, View Render, and just pop over to slot 4, and we'll just render it without the lighting volume. And we should be able to see what it's doing. Okay, so now if we look at slot 4 and slot 3, we can see slot 3 has sort of slightly nicer reflections, and if we had more sort of gaps in between here, we'd probably see like where the light is just bouncing around a bit more accurately, whereas here things are definitely more flat. Okay, so I'm just going to turn my irradiance volume back on, bake that lighting cache again. Here it's pretty quick. Okay, so if I look in my rendered view and look at my render, it's okay. In general, I think it's too dark. If we compare to here, this is obviously a lot brighter. And this image is a lot bluer. This is where things get a little tricky. If you look at some of the images I took with my phone when we were at the gallery last time, some images are really blue, some are really yellow. It can even be how the photographer had their color settings. You know, reproducing color in different environments is a little bit tricky. But let's just keep going with that in mind. I'm going to turn my area light maybe up a little bit more, and I'm going to make it a tiny bit cool just because it's representing what those fluorescent lights are giving us. So I've just clicked it a little bit in the blue direction. I'll just rebake my lights, and we'll see where that's taken us. So let's just view my render, go into a new slot. That's okay. I've been playing around a bit as well. I'll just render over that. And we'll see what we've got here in slot 5. So I think that cooler light is a little bit more realistic now. I'm going to ignore, there's a bit of like, oh, I've left the wood texture on the ceiling. Lol, that's what all those reflections are. Okay, but if we go back here, I think that's too yellow, and I think that's getting a little bit closer. So now I'm just going to quickly fix up that problem on the roof. I think the roof should not have the, if I go here, it shouldn't have wooden wooden floorboards on the roof, I'm just going to put the same wall texture on. A little trick we can do is if I select the roof, shift select the walls and go Command L, I can link materials and just put the same material on the roof, which looks better. Okay, now I'm just going to go into my roof, go into solid mode and hide it so we can see inside. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in some of these spotlights that we can see here. And as is explained in the Ducky 3D tutorial, we have different types of lighting objects to sort of give us different types of recreations of how light works and how light can be emitted. So in this case, I'm going to add a light called a spotlight. And if I'll just bring it somewhere where we can see it. So if I GX, I'll bring it maybe in front of this vase, so it should pop up here. And I'll probably have to GZ, lift it up a little bit. It's pretty big the way it's came in. Maybe I'll just scale it down first and look from the side. Put it down like that. And we'll have to turn up its power. So let's make it like 150. Okay, so we can see now there's a light cone hitting the wall there. Let's make it a little stronger, maybe 300. Okay. Now let's move it around and see if we can get it closer to what we want. So if I'm just going to sort of put it in the position that it would be in the gallery. So I'm going to put it closer to the track, something like that, and I'm going to rotate like that and scale it. So I think we're being occluded by something here. Okay, there we go. Okay, so let's look at some of the settings. We've got the power, which we've already discussed. The radius will give us the radius of like the little light emitting ball, and that will relate to like the crispness of the shadows. Ducky 3D describes this in the tutorial. The size will give us the size of the actual light cone, you know, whether it's a really tight focused spotlight or whether it's kind of broader. We can even look at our lights and sort of, you can kind of just see them. You can see these light cones here. So we might even, I'm just going to scale down our distance, and I might, I'm going to make that size a little smaller. So it's something like, and I'll rotate it, something like what we're seeing in the gallery. And then the blend will control how soft or harsh these shadows are. And again, if we look here, they've got both the fluorescent lights on and the spotlights. So the blending is really kind of soft because there's a lot of light happening in the room. So I'm going to put it somewhere like that. And maybe I'll make it like 350. Make it a little bit stronger. Okay, so then all I'm going to do, let's make sure this spot is in our lights and camera. I forgot to put the area light. Yeah, let's put the area light in the lights and camera collection and the volume in the lights and camera collection. Great. I'm going to hide the volume from the viewport just because it's kind of complicated to look at. And now basically with this spotlight, I'll just GX, I'll move it along, and I'm going to kind of put the lights where they would be in real life. Maybe I need to point them up a little bit more. It is pointed down quite a bit, so let's just rotate that and bring it up like that. And now I'm going to just Shift D, left click, GX, and yeah, I'm just going to move these a little closer to, yeah, that does look about right. You know, how the size of these lights and how they overlap, it's a little bit tricky to guess from here. It really depends on the actual lights we've got here, but I'm just looking at some of the light patterns here. So let's just, and you know, look, there's a lot of these lights here. So let's kind of stay in that sort of theme. So I've got two lights here. I'm just going to hit Shift D, duplicate both of them. And I'm sort of just going to make a row of these lights, Shift D, and now I've got 8 of them. Oops, that's moving the wrong way, GX, not GZ. Something like that. Oh, there's a bit of a gap. And now, to me, it's really starting to look a lot more like our reference image. If I just grab two of these, Shift D, and then RZ90, so they're facing the other way, and I put them here. Here I might need to rotate them a bit. Let's have a look on the y-axis. I could just rotate them a little bit more like that. Let's look from the top down again, press 7. GX, oops, sorry, GY this time. And yeah, you know, it's basically like we're physically lighting the gallery now. Duplicate another one. Okay, I think I've got them pointing kind of too far up. I'm sort of imagining if there were artworks on the wall, maybe they need to be pointed down a little bit more. Something like that. Okay, so now what we're going to do is I'm just going to look at my irradiance volume, and I'm going to bake the lighting cache again because we've added a whole lot more lighting. And oh, I'm not sure if I need to have my roof object kind of visible in the viewport. I don't think so, but I'm going to have it visible anyway, just in case that affects my bake. Let that bake. And now let's go view our render, go into another slot 6, and I'll render over that. And hopefully we should be getting something that's like getting closer to, wait, okay, so I've got our lights. Our lights are looking pretty strong at the moment. We might need to back it off a little bit. But you know, this is something we can play around with, because now we've got so many of them. They're starting to you know, multiply their effect. But you know, if we compare to our reference image in some of these, I don't know. You know, here, for example, we've got the lighting track here is turned off, so that would mean our area light would be lower. And these lights are warmer, the area light's cooler. So, you know, you can really play around with it. But what this should give you is like the basics of getting your lighting set up. There's some other things we haven't looked at. I might do one more lighting tutorial at the end where we add on like an environment light or some like volumetrics. But I think for now, this should be more than enough for you to play around with. And yeah, in the next tutorial, we will come back and have a look at just some of these additional details of making the roof look a bit better, and the fireplace. And then we should be getting pretty close to this virtual gallery recreation. And the final step I'd like to add is, you know, let's say you've made an image and you're happy with it and you want to keep it. You can simply go Image, Save As, and then just save it into anywhere in your computer as a JPEG or PNG or whatever file you like. If you want to raise the resolution of that image, you can just go into your render properties here, set the resolution to whatever you like, and then rendering that still image will give you an image of any resolution within probably some relatively high limit. Okay, I'll see you in the next tutorial.